welcome to HR Recruit's webinar about diversity and inclusion. My name is Amy McLeod and I'm a consultant for HR Recruit. I'm joined today by panellists from Warner Goodman Solicitors, Natasha Young and Karen Clarkson. They will be conducting a presentation and sharing their knowledge about the key points that you will need to consider around diversity and inclusion within the workplace. There will be an opportunity to ask questions throughout the session via the chat box, and there is no email facility contrary to what Zoom may have informed you. I'm now going to pass over to Natasha and she will get started with the slides. Over to you, Natasha.
Thanks, Amy. Well, thank you very much to everyone for coming along today. We are blown away at the number of people that have actually come along. So thank you, really appreciate you giving up your time. We always love presenting at these because, we see so many new faces. So, very welcome if it's your first session today. And again, hopefully there's a lot of you that have been to these sessions previously. We always get lots of engagement at these, and we hope that you feel that you can join in at certain points. However, we always make sure that people feel comfortable to join in on their own basis. So if you don't want to join in, it's purely through chat today. So, you can just watch and listen along if you'd prefer. We are conscious it's just a 1 hour session. So if people do feel that they want to talk to us after the event, we'd love to hear from you. If you haven't come across us before, we are a law firm, but we also provide lots of HR updates and a weekly employment law newsletter, which has case studies of relevance to HR people and business people. So if any of you are interested in that, then do link up with us on LinkedIn. And you can receive those. They're all free, obviously, and you might find them useful. So today, as Amy mentioned, we've got Karen Clarkson and myself taking the session. Karen's our marketing manager. And if any of you are interested in our other events, then do have a look at our website and give Karen a shout. She looks after all of these, as well as all other things marketing related. So I'm Tash Young. I work with the legal team in our employment department, but I am an external consultant for our clients on the HR and training side. In today's session, we'll be exploring the subjects of equality, diversity, and inclusion. So we'll start by having a look at what we mean by these terms. We'll move on to discuss what an inclusion and diversity agenda might look like. We'll explore the business case for it because, a lot of you will be the people that will be selling this in. And looking at the legal risks associated with the area. It is a really big topic, and we could and have taken a couple of days to train on this before. So this is going to be a bit of a whistle-stop tour of some of the key areas that you need to consider. So, there may be questions following this, but hopefully this will give you a bit of a taster of things to look at. Really how to approach it within your organisation as well, because this area is going to be different for each organisation, depending on what your key topics are and what you're looking to achieve. But we'll look at factors that can keep inequality in place. We'll touch on what we mean by unconscious bias, and we'll give you some ideas of what people managers can do to drive that agenda as well. So the aim is to give you some context and really to have a look at where you might start with your own agenda. Okay. So why are we still discussing this subject? Well, quite frankly, because it's still an issue. Let's have a look at some of the headline stats here related to protected characteristics. So women who are working in the fastest growing sectors, such as tech, are 45% more likely than men to leave management positions. There are more men named Dave among the top CEOs than there are female CEOs. There are 8 men called Dave and 6 female CEOs, if anyone wants the detail on that. 1 in 8 of the working population is BAME, but only 1 in 16 are on UK boards. So that means that it has an impact all the way through. 1 in 10 BAME adults are unemployed, compared with 1 in 25 white British adults. By 2030, 26 million people in the UK will be obese. That's 37% of the population. And by 2022, we'll have approximately 12.5 million open jobs, but only 7 million young people. So it really is quite a difference. And so all of these things will have implications, and we'll explore some of these as we go along. Now, many of you, I'm sure, will be aware of the differences in the key terms that we're going to use today, but because I am going to be using them a lot, I thought I will apologise in advance, but still run through what they are, because we have a very large group today with different levels of experience. So I'll just take a couple of minutes to go through these. So diversity refers to the demographic differences of a group, often at organisational level. So diversity will often reference protected characteristics in UK law, and I've listed those out there. So protected characteristics would have to come under one of those areas. Equality means equal rights and opportunities afforded to all. The 2010 Equality Act is the key piece of legislation in the UK which protects those with the protected characteristics from the previous slide from direct and indirect discrimination in the workplace. Now, on this same slide, I've put equity because equity sometimes gets confused with equality, but equity is really where we're talking about recognising that treating everyone the same has shortcomings, and that it might be necessary to treat people differently to enable them to have equal opportunities. Now, this is important because it's often an area where companies fall down. So in the employment team, we'll often be asked for advice on how to deal with an issue when somebody has already raised a grievance, or worse, if they have claimed constructive dismissal because they feel that they've been discriminated against due to having a protected characteristic. And when we speak to the business owner or the line manager, they are quite surprised, and they will respond with something along the lines of, well, we absolutely didn't discriminate. We treated them exactly the same as everyone else. And that's the issue. If you're treating somebody with a protected characteristic the same as everyone else, you might not be doing what you need to be doing from a legal point of view. So inclusion then is often defined as the extent to which everyone in the workplace, regardless of their background, identity or circumstances, feels valued, accepted and supported to exceed at work. So at a basic level, if you were to pick 2 people at random within your organisation, would they feel that they're recognised for who they are and what they bring in the same way as the counterpart? Or would they feel that they were kind of outside of the norm or the usual in some way? And that's the part, is, you know, are they valued for who they are? So what's the business case for investing in this agenda? Well, if we look at, there's quite a lot of research, first of all, that's been going on for longer in the US, particularly the Harvard Review that many of you will have read various articles on, which shows that the participation of women in state level labour markets has shown to have an impact on wage increases for all employees. In the UK, the lead research is really the McGregor report, which identified that if BAME individuals were fully represented in the workforce, they would increase the labour market by £24 billion. The emphasis to date has been mainly on the diversity of organisations, and this is where many businesses have put much of their efforts. So it's easier to measure and cynically to suggest that the company is doing a good job if they can show that they have an increasingly diverse workforce. And many sectors perpetuate this because they have to measure it each year. It's put in company annual reports. Many of you, if you work for larger organisations, will have to do your gender pay gap reporting each year. Obviously delayed a little bit because of COVID. But you know, there's lots of measures in place at the moment that really are measuring diversity rather than measuring anything further than that. So the challenge of this is twofold. Firstly, arguably it should be a given anyway. You know, is it really something to fly a flag on if you're saying we give access to all employees? Because arguably so you should. Secondly, what are you measuring? You can show that you have people from different backgrounds with different characteristics, but it doesn't always show that you've got equity within that workforce. I'm not going to argue that it's not a positive to have diversity. Having a diverse workforce is obviously a good start, and you can't measure equality without it. But there will be some linked aspects that will have an impact, such as the individual employee experience and the culture within the organisation, which relates to this. So inclusion is increasingly being seen as the key way to which businesses can drive change and progress. The difficulty is how to achieve it. The what is known, that by employing inclusive practices, there needs to be a belief from all that different perspectives, beliefs and norms are valued by the organisation and its leaders. But what do we mean when we say that an organisation is inclusive? So inclusion in agendas recognise that workplaces, even diverse ones, are not inclusive for everyone. Employees at the same company or even within the same small team can experience that workplace in a very different way, depending on things like their line manager, their team, but also their own personal background and circumstances. There was some interesting research recently that showed that 23% of LGBT employees who were surveyed felt that they'd been treated negatively at work because they were or because they were thought to be LGBT. And a CIPD survey of BAME employees found that BAME employees were more likely to feel that their background could affect the opportunities that they were given at work. You might find it interesting to read the CIPD Working Lives survey, which found that 22% of employees across a huge range of companies felt that other team members would judge them for being different. And this increases with things like if differences with mental health, for example, where people really are much more worried about speaking out about those sorts of differences. So on that basis, there's an argument that diversity policies on their own might be doing more harm than good by highlighting the difference. And inclusion might be a better starting point for organisations that want to increase diversity. So what do we mean by that? Are we talking about HR policy and practice, the employees' experience, leadership, organisational values? Perhaps it's all of these things. So defining that, and particularly, you know, as we talked about before, defining this for your own company becomes the first step in taking action on inclusion. So if we just pause there for a moment, I'd like now to explore what that starting point might be for you. Now, for some of you, this might be something that you're further down the line than others. Now, because there are rather a lot of you, I think we've got over 200 people here today. We usually have a breakout room at this point, but there's rather a lot of you for breakout rooms. So if you would like to put a point forward, I'd ask you to just put a point in the chat box, And then Karen and I will try to pick up on them without asking you to speak. So don't worry, we're not going to pick on anybody. So first of all, what do you think inclusion could look or feel like at an individual level? Just have a look at the chat there. Yeah, so people being asked to be themselves. Yeah, and being able to be that. Joanna saying flexibility.
There's a couple in the Q&A as well, Tash. So there's being confident to be yourself at work and feeling like you belong, are a couple more comments that have come in.
Yeah, Marta saying to accept differences. Yeah, and so I think the consensus that we're seeing there is at an individual level. Sorry, just having a look. Sabine saying every voice heard, recognised and taken into account. And I think, you know, the general idea there is that at an individual level that there's a sense of belonging, having a voice, you know, as Sabine said there, feeling valued, feeling safe. That's an interesting one, Anthony, but I think that's really important as well, that, you know, feeling comfortable to sort of be yourself. There was some recent research published by the Journal of Management that has shown that there were kind of 3 aspects that they identified. First of all was feeling valued for their own difference and uniqueness. So, you know, it was a positive thing. The second one, authenticity, which has become, I know, an overused word in the last decade. But in this context, it's about allowing individuals to feel as though they can be themselves, whether they are different or similar to others in the group in question. And then belonging and non-conformity. So if the first 2 are satisfied, then it's thought to create a sense of belonging and having a place within a group. Okay, so if we're able to achieve some or all of these things, what positive team outcomes might we be able to find from this? Any ideas? Looking at this, you know, from a kind of HR point of view. So what we've got: confidence in the team and acceptance of differences. Abby's saying more cohesive working. High morale, productivity. Yeah, absolutely. So Deborah's saying high productivity as teams work together. Open conversations, challenging ideas, that collaboration and innovation is definitely coming through there from that acceptance. Yeah, Abby, that's an interesting one from Abby there, saying that, you know, as more the innovation coming from sort of more ideas being brought to the table. And other things that have been sort of seen in the research are reduced absenteeism. You know, quite simply, people feeling that they want to be at work a bit more because they're valuing being with the people that they're working with. As a result, having enhanced job commitment. Lots of feelings of, as you've all identified there, belonging, and, you know, it increases the identity of that team, which can lead to lower turnover, you know, which again, in a sort of circular way, can help cohesion of that team and team identity. Yeah, and I think Leslie's saying they're increased job satisfaction. So, you know, definitely that happiness in the role and everyone feeling that, you know, really can have an impact from a sort of business point of view in terms of those teams, and sort of really seeing, you know, that team identity there, you know, which is made up of valuing all of the others. So finally, at organisational level, what might we see there, and what positive aspects could come out at an organisational level as a result? So Lorna, I think Lorna, you're saying, sorry, I don't know if you put that for the team one, but I think it works for the organisational level. You're saying more engagement and higher retention rates. Cost saving, Joanna, yeah, absolutely. More diversity in leadership positions from Sabine. Yeah, and it is, you know, a place where people want to work, which actually is a great, you know, if people love their job, they tend to talk about it, you know, in the same way as if they hate their job. So, you know, it's a great advertisement for the company overall. So, you know, other things that we haven't mentioned there are perhaps allowing access to development opportunities for all, and really letting that kind of innovation get a grip, pathways for everyone to affect change. And Raheem is saying that, you know, much more representative of the community, so potentially much more valued there by the community that they are in, and seen as an employer of choice as a result as well. Great, well, thank you very much. I sort of can't read them all out, but thank you everyone for the feedback there. I think we'll try and sort of grasp all of those and see if we can sort of collect those ideas without sort of names on, obviously, to feed back to you later. So what factors then keep inequalities in place? So one of the key things is recruiting people like us. We'll go through the different types of bias that we might come across later on, but recruiting people like us is called affinity bias. And when we think of affinity bias, we might think perhaps of some of the traditional organisations where there's a majority of graduate intakes who perhaps have a similar education and background, and might be expected to think or work in a similar way. However, it can occur with other sectors. So I was doing some work recently with a cleaning company, and a lot of their employees were from one very specific ethnic minority group, and they were finding it very difficult to recruit outside of that group, because when they had new members of that group were finding it difficult to fit into. So, you know, although more often it might be traditional organisations and you know, that very sort of traditional old firm sort of background, it's certainly not always. So other factors that might keep inequalities in place are telling employees that they have a voice, but then not listening to what they're saying. And equally, I think telling employees that they have a voice, you know, so perhaps actually having a mechanism to listen, but then when they know what the employees are saying or knowing what the issues are, not acting on them or not acting upon them quickly enough, and not being prepared to take risks because that's not how we do things around here, or that's not how we've done things in the past, and not being prepared to embrace change. So let's look again at how we're advertising our roles and what we're looking for. Does the person specification fit a broad range of people, or are we looking for the same group that we have in our business at the moment? There's definitely something in the idea that if you look in the same place with the same person spec, you're going to get more of the same. One interesting thing to do is to ask other members of the team that you're actually recruiting into, rather than it being the manager and perhaps HR, Ask the employees what's missing from their teams, because they're closest to it. Ask what skills they could do with more of, because again, they'll know what their own skills are and where they struggle. And ask where they've seen people with those skills, because actually, you know, if they are that close to it, perhaps they're the ones that you should be asking, because they can do the advertising better than HR. Not to take anything away from HR people, but you know, it's just getting to that change. I know at the moment a lot of people are struggling with recruitment, and one of the organisations that I work quite closely with has moved from doing quite traditional recruitment to actually focusing much more on just getting employees in the teams to do kind of snapshot videos. And it really has had a big change, because people get a bit of a feel for, you know, the diversity of the team. And, you know, it feels more authentic, you know, to be listening to what they're saying. So what is unconscious bias, and how does it impact on our decisions? So unconscious bias is a bit of a day's course on its own. So this is going to be a little bit of a whistle-stop tour. You'll undoubtedly have heard the term unconscious bias if you haven't been on some training, and it is a really key area for this topic. So although I can't go into it in any depth because of time, I do feel that it's important to talk a little bit about it. So the first thing to say is that, you know, when we're looking at where our biases come from, that everyone has unconscious bias, because biases are preferences for and against something. Although it's interesting, because every time I do some training on this, there's often somebody who says to me that they haven't got any unconscious bias. But really, unconscious bias is the way that the human brain processes a constant flow of information, and make sense of a complex world. You know, when we look at how much information that we take in and how much of it is taken in unconsciously, it's mind-blowing. So to prevent information overload, the brain naturally takes shortcuts, and these shortcuts can cause people to make snap judgments and generalizations. And some generalizations are unfortunately social stereotypes. So whether unconscious biases are positive or negative, the key is that they are unconscious. When people aren't aware of their biases, they can't manage it, which can lead to discriminatory practices and decisions. And unconscious bias goes way beyond race and gender. It can be based on many factors. So it can include age, abilities, religion, sexual orientation, ethnicity, and lots of other things as well. So what can we do about it, and what kind of workplace decisions can be affected by unconscious bias? Well, research shows that people are more susceptible to the influences of unconscious bias in certain situations, such as when they're rushed to make a decision. So if you have to make a quick decision, that's a key point where you can be expected to be, you know, somewhat relying on that unconscious bias. And, you know, one of the situations we might come across in the context of what we're talking about is when people are having to make snap decisions based on a large stack of job applications. So people who are involved in hiring, recruiting, promotions, performance reviews, and disciplinary decisions need to be especially aware of biases. And that's both their own and their organisations. And sometimes it is a mixture of the two. A recent example that I can give you on that is when I was working with a very traditional I suppose, you know, it's a company that's would be, you know, known to you, but have been going for a few hundred years, and was working on a recruitment project there. And one of the recruiters was somebody who was a graduate recruit, had only been working for the company for, I think they were probably in their second year. And they were looking at who should be taken on in the graduate programme. And they were looking very much at the schools that the people had gone to and the background of the people, and because that was their perception of what the organisation wanted. So it actually wasn't, and the leadership certainly didn't want that, but it was interesting because you know, certainly it's their perception of bias, which they hadn't actually had any conversations with anyone about that, but I think it was just based on what they'd seen and their experiences within the business, which, you know, actually the business leaders were looking to change quite significantly. So it is important that we recognise how we're being perceived and how the organisation is being perceived as well as part of that. One of the things that is quite important is to look at the different types of bias that might come into our decisions. So what I'd like to do is just to take you through some of the common types of unconscious bias, because I think in the time that we've got, that gives us a bit more of an idea of how much it can impact. So just to give you some examples, we've got gender bias. I think, you know, we all know what that probably is. It's based on traditional gender stereotypes. But now that gender identity is much different than it was, you know, a few decades ago, you know, that's quite outdated now. Name bias, some of you will have come across before. So this is when a judgment's made about a person based on their name and their perceived background. And you know, a lot of what we do is actually to try and alleviate that by taking names off things in the recruitment process now. Affinity bias, which is the tendency to relate and gravitate towards people who share the same race, gender, age, or educational background. And one of the quick tests that I do on this is I ask people to write down at the beginning of a course who their 5 people closest to them are, who aren't their family. And it's interesting, you know, even if you think that that bias isn't there, how much of that is, you know, of the same. Conformity bias. So this is a tendency for people to act similarly around people around them, regardless of their own personal beliefs. So this phenomenon is called groupthink, and made infamous by Dominic Cummings when talking about the COVID mistakes recently. So you know, it's trying to fit in with the group regardless of their own beliefs. Ageism, not just with older people, but with younger ones as well. Confirmation bias. So this is a tendency to look for or favour information that supports beliefs that you've already got. Attribution bias. So this is where somebody tries to understand their own or somebody else's behaviour by attributing a reason for it. So you might have a hiring manager who's in a really bad mood that day, and they might assume that a candidate who arrives for an interview a few minutes late has a problem with timekeeping. Whereas in fact, there might be a good reason for the delay. Theodore is reminding me of beauty bias, which I always think is an interesting one as well, where people tend to assume that more attractive people are better in some way than an unattractive person. Remember, this is unconscious, so often seen on TV, In celebrity culture, viewers tend to tune in more when there's more positive roles are played by attractive people, and the baddies, as my children call them, are less attractive. And it's interesting, that one. It's inbuilt. Even the research has shown that even children make more positive inferences when evaluating more attractive adults. So it's even before we get to work. It just shows how unconscious these things are. But it is an interesting one. It was shown that people who were seen to be attractive were earning 15% higher salaries in the US. I think that's a particularly interesting one because it can have a flip later on when perhaps very attractive women can, when they get to higher positions within businesses, can be judged to have only got there because of their attractiveness rather than looking at different measures as well. So what can people managers do to drive that agenda? So we can facilitate opportunities for all employees to feel heard. So this isn't the same as giving feedback. It's actually showing that you have heard them and that you're understanding them. Allowing everyone to have an influence on important decisions. So do they know who's representing them? Are they being asked their opinion? And do they feel that they are being represented? You know, is the right person there speaking for them? Ensuring that the leaders are driving this. So are they listening and are they acting? Making sure the feedback is there. So even if everyone is being heard, what is happening? You know, are you telling them that you've heard them and what you're going to do as a result? So, you know, it's really checking how they know. HR policies and practices on their own won't create an inclusive culture. In fact, the failure of some organisations to implement the lovely policies and practices that are there can speak volumes who might feel outside of that culture. So really important to check that your employees feel listened to and that their opinions are actively sought on decisions that concern them. Often organisations will have a staff feedback group, but only tend to be consulted on a small number of issues. And sometimes when the decision has already been made in reality. So do your staff know who represents them and that this will actually happen? Have they got that confidence? And did they help to elect the person who's actually going to be representing them? Were they given a choice? Are you checking in with them that they feel as though that person is actually representing their views? Because if they feel as though it's a fait accompli, that quite often isn't going to happen. Are your leaders championing this? Really important. Are they constantly talking about it, checking in with individuals as they're walking around? So are they walking around? When was, yeah, very easy to sense check that by talking to your staff and saying, you know, asking them when was the last time that they spoke to the leaders as well. So we're going to have a look at what people managers can do to drive the agenda. There's some practical ideas to help combat unconscious bias. So one of the ways to combat unconscious bias is to slow down the decision-making process. As I said earlier, one of the key times when you're going to get that unconscious bias is where there's got to be snap decisions. So, you know, it sounds flippant, but actually if you slow down that process and potentially bring a period of consideration in, then you can analyse and test the decision that's being put forward. If you keep recruiting from the same pool, you're more likely to get the same sort of people. So it's about bringing new ideas in and checking carefully during the onboarding stage, where you've got a key moment where you might lose them, whether they feel listened to and that barriers are not perceived to be in place against those ideas. If you cross-train employees, if you're able to offer those opportunities as much as possible, then you allow people more development opportunities in areas that you might not have originally considered them for. And that can only be a benefit to the business. Mentoring and allyship as well. You know, this is something that's really been successful for all larger organisations. So they might have straight allies, for example, but that can be difficult to put into place and might not be appropriate for smaller organisations. But mentoring can be quite cheap to do, and also benefits by having supporters where they might not have existed before, is low cost and is actually a development opportunity for both the person who is the mentor and the person who's being mentored. The other thing really is to put in some level of unconscious bias training, because if people know that everyone has some level of unconscious bias and that conversation is there, they can understand themselves better and can self-check to see how that's happening. So final feedback, where are we on time? So we've just got a bit of time. So what I'd like to do here is to really ask you to share again, if you wouldn't mind, what's worked well and what has worked not so well in your organisation with regard to something that you might have done to aid inclusivity. If you can put that, any ideas on that in the chat again, and it would be great to share those. I'll try and go through as many as I can.
Sorry, I was just going to say, Tash, while we're waiting for people to put their comments in, we've had a question from Lorna, which I don't know, it might be a bit of a long answer from you, but what if HR can't get the buy-in of leaders? Didn't know whether you wanted to maybe tackle that while people are putting their comments in the chat.
Yeah, I mean, it might be a bit of a long answer. I'll try and give you the shortened version. I think essentially, and I'm not trying to cop out this all a bit, it's trying to work out why. So we need to have a look at why the leaders can't get the buy-in. Usually it's because they can't see the business case, and I think it's, you know, it's often looking at personalities for those leaders, you know, and trying to understand what it is that is making people feel as though carrying on in the same vein is going to be the right answer if they can see their issues. So often it's either that they can't see that there are issues, or it's about not really understanding that business case. So sometimes it's about approach, but you know, it's often about finding the business case for that organization and showing them what can be achieved, sometimes with comparators and things like that as well. So absolutely happy to talk to you about your own sort of personal situation on that, and you know, perhaps we can get some ideas together about how you might sort of try some other things that have worked with other companies like yours, and I can sort of give you some pointers.
Thanks,
just
Kat.
some other bits that have come through there. So Catherine has said that reverse mentoring has worked really well, and you know, that's part of a D&I network there, mentoring their senior leaders. And I think that's something that a lot of the large organizations, particularly in sort of professional services, are using more and more, and it's really, really interesting. And quite often some of the senior leaders go into that a bit dubiously, in my opinion, and think that they're not going to get much out of it, and quite often are really, really surprised by what they learn about, you know, how people are thinking differently, and people from different backgrounds, teaching them a lot. So Sabine is saying unconscious bias training, it's been proven numerous times that it doesn't really change behaviours, and it is a tricky one. I think, Sabrina, I think you're right. There is mixed results on this. In the difficulty, I think, is that a lot of people do the training and then don't do anything with it. So it just becomes something that everyone talks about for a week and then it gets left. And I think it can then get a bit of a bad name. So it's really about looking how those behaviours are embedded within the organisation, how you work with that going forward. It certainly can't be unconscious bias training and then left to as a yes, we've done that now. It isn't that. So we've got DEI committees working with Stonewall, compulsory training, talking openly to employees and having internal speakers from a diverse audience. I mean, that sounds as though you're doing huge amounts of things there. And, I appreciate that's not possible for all types of organisations, but in larger organisations, I think, that's hugely important. So Helen's saying personal stories and lived experiences published on the intranet. I mean, that's a great idea. Lots of things that, even smaller organisations might be able to do as well. So lots of wellbeing challenges and resources, lots of L&D support for leaders around feedback, well-rounded ongoing conversations and check-ins with the teams, and setting up employee networks for different groups. So, there's lots of things there that, perhaps wouldn't work for like really small organisations, although, perhaps even some of the smaller organisations might be able to do something with kind of the intranet. But certainly for medium-sized organisations, there's lots of sort of personal experience stuff there that would be really useful. And then, so Theodore's talking about active bystander training as well, which can be quite useful, which, he says is calling out bad behaviours. It's, what, from a values point of view, what is acceptable, and being shown how to deal with behaviours that you feel uncomfortable with and aren't correct, and how to manage those in the organisation. So Imogen's talking about giving a platform to underrepresented employees. Again, this, I think that's coming through quite heavily in terms of some of the larger organisations. Leslie talking about setting up a DEI working group, but saying it's difficult to gain traction, and to iron out what that should look like. So some great ideas there, and I think what's coming out for me there is that it's obviously quite different depending on the size of your organisation. It's obviously impacted by loads of other things as well, such as your leadership team and where they are on this issue at the moment, and how much pressure you're getting from your employers, what your recruitment issues are at the moment. So lots of different things that are going to make your individual situation different in some way from other people's. But hopefully there's some ideas there, and what I'd like to do is we'll take a kind of a cut and paste of that, and I won't use anyone's name, but I'll try and put together a bit of a summary of some of the ideas that people are saying are working for them, and then we can send that out. So that would be good. Theodore's saying having a D&I dashboard that can measure different aspects as well, it is good. I think it is about measuring, but it's also getting that balance between the measuring of the diversity, but also getting the personal views as well. and actually sort of touching in with people and saying how they're feeling, and whether they are feeling that they are included, and doing that regularly, so that it isn't just a sort of flash in the pan idea that, you know, oh, now we're doing diversity and inclusion and it becomes flavour of the month. I think it's got to be ingrained within the culture. Okay, just see if there's anything else that we need to sort of pick up on that.
I've just taken a screenshot of everything that's in the chat for you, Tash, so I'll send it across to you.
That'd be fantastic. Thanks, Amy. So thank you for sharing those. Just check where we are on time. So we're just coming up to the end, so I will finish there for today. But before I hand back to Amy, obviously we touched on some of those issues that we need to spend more time on if we're actually going to do something about it on a practical basis. We do actually have a practical session that's run by our company for those of you who are considering your company's diversity and inclusion agenda. So that we've got a session next week. If that's something that people are actually actively working on at the moment, do have a look on our website, because we are running a practical session that would be useful for you. Again, it's just an hour, but it's very practical and it looks to give you some kind of ways of taking this forward, and also to meet lots of other people who are doing the same thing. And I think, you know, you can see from today that, you know, it's always useful to get lots of ideas from people who are currently doing it in terms of things they've tried that haven't worked as well as things that have. So if you are interested in that, then I think Amy will send out the details later on, but do have a look on our website and it gives you a bit more information. I think Amy will send out a little bit more information later on as well. So hopefully we might see some of you there. But thanks very much for listening today. And I'm going to hand back to Amy to finish off.
Thank you, Tash. Yes, so I will send out an email to everyone after the session has ended, which will include copies of today's slides, a link to join our free Guilds networking app for HR professionals, and then details of the session that Natasha's just mentioned, of the Warner Goodman event that will be hosted on the 9th of November. This event would be based on the practical ways you can implement change in your company on this topic. I'll also post about today's event on LinkedIn. We do not charge for these events, therefore I'd really appreciate it if you could add a comment or like my post to increase our brand awareness. If anyone is recruiting, we also have Accountancy Recruit and FD Recruit within our group alongside HR Recruit. So feel free to contact me and I can put you in touch with the relevant consultant. Finally, a massive thank you to our panelists for their time and to all our listeners for tuning in. So everybody enjoy the rest of your day.